The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked alongside his protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Mills. It was a crisp October day, and the young prince had requested to take his usual morning walk through the castle gardens before his tutoring sessions began. George had always been curious about the people who worked at the palace. Unlike many children his age who might take such grandeur for granted, he possessed an unusual awareness of the countless individuals who made royal life possible. His parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, had instilled in him the importance of recognizing and appreciating everyone's contributions, no matter how small their role might seem. As they rounded the corner near the Queen's Guard post, George noticed something different. The usually composed and statue-like guardsman was shifting slightly, his breathing appearing labored behind the iconic bearskin hat. Most people would have walked past without a second glance, trained as they were to ignore the guards who stood like living monuments throughout the palace grounds. But George stopped walking. "D.I. Mills," he said quietly, tugging gently on his protection officer's sleeve. "Something's wrong with the guard." Sarah Mills looked toward the red-uniformed figure standing at attention. To her trained eye, she could see what the young prince had noticed. The guard's hands, which should have been steady on his rifle, trembled almost imperceptibly. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm that suggested distress rather than the controlled breathing of a soldier at his post. "You're right, Your Royal Highness," she murmured, her professional instincts immediately alert. "We should inform the sergeant of the guard." But George was already moving forward, his small feet carrying him across the gravel path toward the guardsman. Sarah followed closely, her hand instinctively moving toward her radio to call for backup if needed. As they approached, it became clear that the guard was indeed in distress. Guardsman Thomas Fletcher, a 23-year-old soldier from Yorkshire, was experiencing what would later be identified as a severe asthma attack. The combination of the morning's unusually high pollen count and his nervousness about being on duty at such a prestigious posting had triggered a response his body couldn't control. The irony wasn't lost on those who would later hear the story. Here was a young man trained to protect others, to stand firm in the face of any threat, brought low by something as invisible as the air he breathed. The weight of his bearskin hat, normally a symbol of pride and tradition, felt crushing. His rifle, an extension of his military bearing, seemed impossibly heavy. Thomas had been fighting the attack for nearly 20 minutes, hoping it would pass without anyone noticing. He knew the protocols. He knew he should signal for relief. But pride and duty warred with his body's desperate need for help. He had dreamed of this posting since joining the Grenadier Guards, and the thought of being seen as weak or unreliable was almost as suffocating as his constricted airways. Prince George, however, saw none of the uniform or the ceremony. He saw only a person in need. "Excuse me," the young prince said softly, his voice carrying the polite but confident tone that had been carefully cultivated through years of royal training. "Are you feeling unwell?" The question hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds. The formal, rigid world of palace protocol and the simple human world of one person caring for another. According to centuries of tradition, guards on duty were not supposed to speak or move unless specifically ordered by their superiors. They were living statues, symbols of unwavering British resolve. Thomas Fletcher found himself at an impossible crossroads. His training demanded silence, but his body screamed for help. The young prince's concerned face, visible in his peripheral vision, seemed to understand the dilemma without words. George looked up at D.I. Mills, then back at the struggling guardsman. In that moment, the 10-year-old made a decision that would ripple through the palace hierarchy and beyond. He stepped closer to the guard, close enough that his voice would carry clearly without drawing attention from others in the area. "I'm going to ask my protection officer to get help," he said simply. "You don't have to say anything or do anything. Just know that someone's coming." The relief in Thomas Fletcher's eyes was visible even behind the formal mask of his military bearing. For the first time in 20 minutes, his breathing seemed to ease slightly, not because the attack was subsiding, but because the crushing weight of handling it alone had been lifted. Sarah Mills was already on her radio, speaking in the coded language that palace security used to communicate without causing alarm. Within moments, the palace's medical team would be discreetly alerted, and arrangements would be made to provide relief for Guardsman Fletcher without disrupting the careful choreography of royal security. But in those few moments before help arrived, something extraordinary happened in that quiet corner of the castle grounds. A 10-year-old boy, who would someday inherit one of the world's oldest monarchies, stood quietly beside a young soldier, offering nothing more than his presence and the knowledge that he was not alone. The morning sun continued to cast its long shadows, but somehow the atmosphere had shifted. What had begun as a routine walk through the palace gardens had become something else entirely, a lesson in leadership that no classroom could teach and no textbook could capture. As they waited for help to arrive, George found himself thinking about all the people he had walked past during his life at the palace: gardeners, housekeepers, drivers, guards, all of them part of the intricate web that supported his family's role. He wondered how many times someone might have needed help, but felt unable to ask for it because of who he was, because of the distance that protocol and tradition created between them. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of the palace medical team, led by Dr. Margaret Whitfield, the royal household's chief physician. Behind her came Sergeant Major Harrison, whose job it would be to ensure that the situation was handled with both care for the guardsmen and respect for the security protocols that kept the royal family safe. As the professionals took over, Prince George stepped back, but he didn't leave. He watched as they efficiently and discreetly provided assistance to Thomas Fletcher, noting how they managed to maintain the guardsman's dignity while ensuring he received the care he needed. It was a masterclass in quiet competence, and George found himself storing away the lessons he observed: how help could be provided without fanfare, how strength sometimes meant accepting assistance, and how true leadership often meant simply seeing people as people, regardless of their role or position. The incident that had begun with a small boy's observation would soon become something much larger, but in that moment, it was simply what it had always been: one human being helping another when help was needed. Word of the incident spread through the palace staff with the quiet efficiency that characterizes all communication within royal households. It wasn't gossip exactly, but rather the kind of information sharing that happens when something genuinely noteworthy occurs in a world where noteworthy events are carefully managed and controlled. Dr. Margaret Whitfield made her report to the private secretary's office within an hour of treating Guardsman Fletcher. The medical emergency had been resolved quickly and professionally, but the circumstances surrounding it had created ripples that extended far beyond a simple asthma attack. The young prince's intervention likely prevented a more serious situation, she explained to Sir Edmund Crawford, the private secretary to the Prince of Wales. Guardsman Fletcher was experiencing a severe asthma attack and had been struggling for some time before Prince George noticed his distress. Sir Edmund listened carefully, his experienced mind already calculating the various implications of the incident. In his 30 years of service to the royal household, he had seen how small moments could become significant ones, how a simple act of kindness could resonate far beyond its immediate impact. What's remarkable, Dr. Whitfield continued, isn't just that the prince noticed when others didn't, but how he handled the situation. He understood instinctively that the guardsman was caught between duty and need, and he found a way to provide help without forcing the soldier to break protocol. The doctor's words would prove prophetic. Within days, the story had reached the highest levels of both the royal household and the military hierarchy. Guardsman Fletcher, after receiving proper medical treatment, and being cleared for duty, found himself summoned to provide his own account of the events. Thomas Fletcher had never imagined he would find himself sitting across from senior officers, recounting how a 10-year-old prince had potentially saved his military career. In the formal setting of the guard commander's office, surrounded by portraits of distinguished soldiers and shelves lined with military history, he struggled to find words for what had happened. The young prince could have simply walked past, Fletcher explained to Colonel James Morrison, commanding officer of the Grenadier Guards. Most people do. We're trained to be invisible when we're on duty, to blend into the background. But he saw me as a person, not just a uniform. Colonel Morrison nodded thoughtfully. He had served for over 25 years, had seen countless examples of military bearing and discipline, but he was increasingly intrigued by this account of something that transcended traditional military values while somehow embodying them at the highest level. "Tell me about the moment when he approached you," the colonel requested. Fletcher's eyes took on a distant look as he recalled those crucial minutes. "I was fighting the attack, sir, trying to maintain my position and hoping it would pass. I could feel my strength fading, but I couldn't abandon my post. Then I heard this young voice, very polite, very calm, asking if I was unwell. And what went through your mind? Honestly, sir, relief. Not just because help was coming, but because someone had seen me struggling and cared enough to do something about it. The prince didn't make a big show of it, didn't call attention to my situation. He just quietly ensured that help would come." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Fletcher providing details about the incident and its aftermath. What emerged was a picture of a young boy who had somehow understood not just the immediate medical emergency, but the complex web of duty, pride, and protocol that had prevented the guardsman from seeking help himself. Meanwhile, in another part of the castle, Prince George was having his own conversation about the morning's events. His mother, the Princess of Wales, had heard about the incident through official channels and wanted to understand her son's perspective on what had happened. "I just noticed he didn't look right," George explained simply as they sat together in the private family sitting room. "He was trying to stand straight like guards are supposed to, but something was wrong. I thought someone should help him." Catherine, the Princess of Wales, studied her eldest son's face, seeing in his earnest expression the same qualities that had made his father such an effective future king: empathy tempered with duty, compassion guided by understanding. "You realize that what you did was quite significant," she said gently. "Not just because you helped someone who needed it, but because of how you helped him." George looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "You found a way to respect his position while addressing his need," his mother explained. "You didn't embarrass him or put him in an impossible situation. You simply ensured that help would come without requiring him to abandon his duty." The concept was complex for a 10-year-old, but George seemed to grasp its essence. He had learned something important that morning about the difference between helping and truly serving others. The story might have remained a private family lesson, but the implications of George's action were reverberating through the military establishment in ways that surprised everyone involved. Colonel Morrison had shared Fletcher's account with his superiors, and the response had been immediate and unanimous. This incident represented something significant about leadership and service. General Sir Patrick Williams, Chief of the General Staff, received the report during his weekly briefing on matters affecting the Household Division. The incident involving Prince George and Guardsman Fletcher was mentioned almost as an afterthought, but it captured his attention in a way that more formal matters had not. "This young prince demonstrated more understanding of military leadership in 10 minutes than some officers develop in years," he remarked to his aide-de-camp. "He saw the situation, understood the constraints, and found a solution that preserved everyone's dignity while addressing the immediate need." The general's comment would soon reach other ears, including those of the king himself. Charles III, who had spent decades learning the intricacies of leadership and service, was struck by the account of his grandson's instinctive understanding of these principles. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Sergeant Major Harrison, the senior non-commissioned officer who had responded to the incident, requested a private audience with his commanding officer. This was unusual enough to command immediate attention. "Sir," Harrison began, his bearing as crisp as always despite the informal nature of the conversation, "I've been thinking about yesterday's incident, and I believe it raises some important questions about how we train our people to handle situations where duty and personal welfare conflict." Colonel Morrison leaned back in his chair, intrigued. Sergeant Major Harrison was not given to philosophical observations, and his request for this meeting had been both unexpected and compelling. "Go on, Sergeant Major." "Guardsman Fletcher is a good soldier, sir. But he was caught between two competing duties, maintaining his post and protecting his own welfare. The young prince somehow understood this immediately and found a way to resolve the conflict. I think we need to examine whether our training adequately prepares our soldiers for such situations." The conversation that followed would lead to changes in training protocols, but more immediately, it sparked a recognition that Prince George's action had illuminated something important about leadership itself. He had demonstrated that true authority lay not in commanding obedience, but in understanding the human complexities that exist within any system of duty and service. As word of the incident continued to spread, it began to take on a significance that none of the original participants had anticipated. What had begun as a simple act of noticing someone in distress had become a teaching moment about leadership, compassion, and the delicate balance between duty and humanity that defines the best of public service. 3 weeks after the incident in the castle gardens, an unusual ceremony was taking place in the private quarters of Windsor Castle. It wasn't marked on any official calendar, nor would it appear in the court circular that documented the royal family's public engagements. This was something different entirely, a quiet acknowledgement of an extraordinary moment. Prince George sat in the Oak Room alongside his parents, facing a small gathering that included Guardsman Thomas Fletcher, now fully recovered and returned to duty. Beside Fletcher stood Sergeant Major Harrison, Colonel Morrison, and several other senior officers from the Household Division. The formality of the setting contrasted sharply with the intimate nature of what was about to unfold. King Charles III had requested this private meeting after hearing the full account of his grandson's actions. The king, who had spent his entire life learning the complexities of leadership and service, recognized that something significant had occurred, something that transcended the usual boundaries between royal protocol and human compassion. "Thomas," the king began, addressing Guardsman Fletcher directly, "I understand you've fully recovered from your medical emergency." "Yes, Your Majesty, completely fit for duty, sir." "I'm pleased to hear it, but we're here today not just because of your health, but because of what happened during those difficult moments, and how my grandson responded to your situation." Fletcher stood a bit straighter, if such a thing were possible. Being addressed directly by the king was honor enough, but the context made it almost surreal. The king turned to Prince George, who had been listening intently to the conversation. "George, I've heard several accounts of what happened that morning. I'd like to hear yours." The 10-year-old looked around the room at the assembled adults, all of whom were watching him with expressions of genuine interest and respect. It was a heavy responsibility for someone so young, but George had been raised to understand that his words and actions carried weight. "I saw that he was having trouble breathing," George said simply. "He looked like he wanted to ask for help but couldn't. So I thought someone else should ask for him." The simplicity of the explanation hung in the air for a moment. In 15 words, the young prince had summarized a complex understanding of duty, dignity, and service that had taken the adults in the room decades to fully appreciate. Colonel Morrison stepped forward slightly. Your Royal Highness, if I may, what you did that day demonstrated a level of leadership that we spend years trying to teach our officers. You saw the human need within the military requirement and found a way to address both. George looked puzzled. I just thought someone should help him. Exactly, said Sergeant Major Harrison, speaking for the first time. You didn't think about protocol or procedures or what was proper. You saw someone who needed help and you made sure they got it. That's what real leadership looks like. The Sergeant Major's words carried particular weight, coming as they did from someone whose entire career had been built on understanding and enforcing military discipline. For him to praise an action that technically violated protocol spoke to something profound about the nature of true authority. King Charles nodded thoughtfully. What strikes me most about this incident is how it demonstrates that genuine leadership often means finding ways to serve others while preserving their dignity. George, you could have simply alerted the guards, but instead you found a way to ensure that Thomas could receive help without feeling that he had failed in his duty. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with each participant sharing their perspective on the incident and its implications. What emerged was a picture of leadership that transcended traditional hierarchies and focused instead on the fundamental human connections that make any organization truly effective. Thomas Fletcher, who had remained mostly silent during the discussion, finally spoke up. Your Royal Highness, if I may, that morning changed how I think about service. You showed me that true strength sometimes means accepting help, and that real leadership means creating space for others to be human. As the formal part of the meeting concluded, something unexpected happened. Prince George stood up and walked over to Thomas Fletcher, extending his hand in a gesture that was both formal and deeply personal. Thank you for protecting us, he said simply. I hope you're feeling better. Fletcher shook the young prince's hand, momentarily overcome by the straightforward sincerity of the gesture. Thank you, Your Royal Highness, for everything. The incident would have several lasting impacts that extended far beyond that private ceremony. Within the military establishment, it sparked a comprehensive review of training protocols, particularly around situations where personal welfare and duty might conflict. The Guard Training Manual was updated to include specific guidance on seeking medical assistance while on duty, removing the ambiguity that had left Thomas Fletcher struggling alone. More broadly, the story became part of the institutional memory of the royal household, a reminder that effective leadership often meant seeing past roles and protocols to the human realities underneath. Staff members would reference the Prince George incident in training sessions for years to come, using it as an example of how true service meant putting people's well-being first. For Prince George himself, the experience became a foundational moment in his understanding of what it meant to be royal. He had learned that his position brought not just privilege, but responsibility. The responsibility to notice when others were struggling and to use his influence to help them. The young prince began paying closer attention to the people around him during his daily routines. He started conversations with staff members, learned their names, and showed genuine interest in their lives and families. These weren't grand gestures, but small acts of recognition that had profound effects on the people who dedicated their lives to serving the royal family. 6 months later, Thomas Fletcher was promoted to Lance Corporal, a recognition of both his exemplary service and his role in highlighting important questions about military welfare protocols. He remained stationed at Windsor and occasionally crossed paths with Prince George during the prince's walks through the castle grounds. Their interactions were always brief and formal, but there remained between them an understanding forged in that moment when a young boy had seen past a uniform to the struggling person underneath. It was a connection that transcended rank and protocol, built on the simple recognition that everyone, regardless of their role or position, deserved to be seen as a human being. The story of Prince George's intervention that October morning became more than just an anecdote about royal kindness. It became a teaching story about the nature of leadership itself, how true authority comes not from commanding others, but from serving them, how real strength is demonstrated not by standing alone, but by ensuring that no one has to. Years later, when Prince George would begin his formal military training, instructors would reference the incident as an example of the kind of leader they hoped to develop, someone who could see beyond the requirements of duty to the human realities that give duty meaning. The small act that had halted normal palace routine for a few crucial minutes had created ripples that would influence military training, royal service protocols, and the development of a future king. But perhaps most importantly, it had demonstrated that sometimes the most profound leadership comes not from grand gestures or formal pronouncements, but from the simple act of noticing when someone needs help and making sure they receive it. In the end, Prince George's heartfelt intervention had done more than save one guardsman from a medical emergency. It had illuminated the timeless truth that real leadership is always, ultimately about service. Service that sees past roles and regulations to the fundamental human dignity that connects us all.